So this is chapter 18, which is conservation of biodiversity. So basically what this section, this first little section is about, is talking about the sixth extinction. So we've had 5 mass extinctions. And so what is the 6th mass extinction? So a lot of scientists think that we're on the verge of another mass extinction. And what is the potential cause? So this one's interesting because this is the first extinction that man has been around for. And so a lot of scientists are contributing this to man. So that 6th extinction would be man-made. And then just a little bit of information. Yellowstone was the first national park. Don't know if that'll pop up anywhere, but interesting, and something that you should probably know, seeing how we're looking at biodiversity preservation. And then human causes of declining biodiversity. So humans, by what they do, cutting down forests, planting, building, kind of encroaching on land, leads to loss of biodiversity. And we talked about that first, I believe, in chapter 4, 4 and 5, when we talked about biomes. So this is module 59. And so biodiversity declines are basically happening at all levels. And so these are the 3 levels that they refer to. So there's genetic level, there's species, and then there's ecosystem. So at the genetic level, that would be changes in the genes, changes in gene frequency, maybe even genetic modification in a way, that could be genetic. And then species would be species changing, maybe thinking about, for example, changing the way that that cows are, for example, for our meat. So instead of having a huge variety of different types of animals, we might selectively choose for a certain type based on what we need it for. So that would be species changes, and that could happen naturally too. It doesn't have to be all man-made. And then ecosystem, so changes in the ecosystem. This could be because of climate change. We've got ecosystems changing. It could be because we are using a certain ecosystem for our own benefit. Maybe urban sprawl, things like that could cause biodiversity changes. So thinking about these 3, which of these could be anthropogenic? So which ones could be man-made? Well, they all could be man-made. Which ones not? So all of them could be not also. But genetic is probably the one that would be the most non-anthropogenic, unless we're doing genetic modification. But genetic changes, mutations, things like that, those all lead to biodiversity. And for the most part, those are natural. Like I said, GMO is not. But slight variations, mutations, things like that are all create biodiversity. And then moving down here, a low genetic diversity equals low survivability, if you're looking at environmental changes. So if in the environment you have a small number of variations, if there's a disturbance in that environment, and let's say that it doesn't select for that particular organism, well, then we're going to have quite a bit of die-off. There's not going to be a good success rate in that ecosystem. But if there's a high genetic diversity, then you have a lot of variations. So if something happens where one trait is not selected for, then the other ones would survive. So it would still be diverse. We did an activity where you had you guys were different trees, and there was a disease that went through the trees, and some of the trees died off. And in the forest that there was a huge diversity of different types of trees, we still had forest left. The forest, when we had a low diversity, if there was a disease that wiped out a certain type of tree, it wiped out most of the forest. So that would be an example of low genetic diversity versus high. And then the bottleneck effect is also something that is brought up, and that was brought up back in, I believe, chapter 5. But basically, because of small areas of migration between habitat, and we're talking about things generally that have a large habitat, so large mammals tend to have a large migration pattern. And so we can get isolated organisms in different areas, especially if they can't migrate and crossbreed. And so you get kind of little genetic variation with this bottleneck effect. So that can occur naturally. It was brought up back in, I believe, chapter 4 or 5. It talked about the Florida panther and how they all had crooked tails, so they were kind of inbred and had crooked tails. Well, that was the bottleneck effect. And so that was caused naturally. But humans can also do the same thing by overhunting in an area, maybe developing and cutting off access to different migrations. So if we build in between two migration patterns, well, then those organisms can no longer interbreed. And so now we get more of a low genetic diversity because you get more of the same genes popping up. So that would be an example. And then moving on to the next page, I kind of brought this up again. Remember the crooked-tailed panther of Florida. So they do talk about it in here again, and that's just a decline in genetic diversity due to the bottleneck effect. So there's natural genetic variation, and that's being lost for, if we look at humans interfering, that's being lost because we're selectively breeding for certain traits. So think about livestock like cows, pigs, birds, apples. It could be anything. So we selectively breed for something, a certain something. So the taste, the meat, the size. And so what we're doing is we are minimizing the traits we don't want. And we're losing genetic variation. And so if we look at the types of apples we have, or the types of cows we have, or chickens, or whatever we're looking at, we are decreasing the diversity because we're breeding for a selective trait. So that can be both plants and animals. And then over here, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Know what that is. So why do we save seeds? Why are we saving all these seeds in a certain place in Norway? And what is that for? Or what is that safeguarding for? So just kind of know about that and why we're doing that. And then if we look over here, what is the difference between a mass extinction versus an extinction? So, we're on the verge of a sixth mass extinction potentially. So how is that different from just extinction in general? And then threatened species versus near threatened, that is brought up down here, where we look at the IUCN. So they categorize species based on 5 traits. So these 5 traits I listed, they're data deficient. So this would be simply that we don't have data on it. So we are discovering, on the order of 1 to 10 new species a year. At least. And so obviously those would be data deficient as we're just discovering them. So number 2, extinct. And then 3, threatened. 4, near threatened. So know the difference between those two. And then 5, least concern. So these would be organisms that aren't keystone species. They don't have a huge role in their ecosystem. We don't use them for anything. So those would be kind of, of course we still care about them, but they're the least concern out of the number 2, 3, and 4 there. And then moving up to the top here, understand what this figure shows. So it shows threatened, near threatened, and least concern out of these categories. So conifers, which are like pine trees, birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, fish. So you don't need to memorize the numbers, but just kind of understand. If we look at this, amphibians have the most threatened species out of all of the different categories here. And amphibians are really, really sensitive to change. They're really sensitive to pH in the water change, acid rain, temperatures. They're sensitive to the amount of water. So they are really kind of an indicator species for climate change. But you can see 41% are threatened. That's quite a bit. And then second is conifers. So conifers, the reason they are is because they have a certain selective area where they live. They have to have a certain climate. They have a certain latitude on Earth that they live at, or altitude, and they don't move. As climate changes and climate belts change, different biomes change. And so those conifers don't really readily just get up and move. So their seeds have to blow, or, and they have to be carried over vast areas. So that's why a lot of those are threatened. And then kind of tied for third would be mammals and reptiles, as far as the threatened species go. So just kind of be familiar with that. Know that amphibians are the top threatened species, or not species, but category there. And then if we look down here, so intrinsic value versus instrumental value. So intrinsic means that we value it just because. So it's independent of human needs or use. We don't use it. We don't need it. We value it because we should, and we should care about it. So we care about the environment. We care about certain, we set aside BLM land. We set aside federal parks, not because they serve some purpose, necessarily, but they have intrinsic value. They're beautiful. We should do that. We need to preserve the animals that are there. So those kinds of things. And then in instrumental value, it does serve a purpose. So this is mainly for humans. It might be instrumental as far as like a wetland, filtering water, but for the most part, if we put an instrumental value on it, it means that it serves a purpose for humans. Do the math, just be familiar with this. We will next week do a worksheet with do the math, but just kind of be familiar with that. And then provisions. Provisions are goods that we produce for us. So this could be lumber from the forest. It could be medicine from certain plants, things like that. So those are just things that we use, that the ecosystem gives us. And then a regulatory service. Basically, ecosystems help keep order and balance. So I mentioned the wetlands. They help to filter the water. They supply clean water to the aquifers. And then some other things I listed up here: CO2 uptake by forests. So forests play a huge role, especially along the equator, the tropical rainforest. They play a huge role in taking in CO2 and kind of offsetting the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. So that's a great regulating service. And then all of the cycles that we talked about at the beginning of the year, the water, carbon, sulfur, nitrogen cycles, all of those things are regulated by plants and animals. And so those are regulating services that those plants and animals contribute. And then the next thing is support service. So a support system would be, it supports, it doesn't play a huge role, or we don't notice it. You can't notice it right off the bat. So a wetland ecosystem service, the wetlands purifying the water, we don't readily see that, but it's there and it's happening. And then also honeybee pollination. Without that, we would not be able to have the agriculture that we have. So they are extremely important in pollinating plants. And we're starting to see that with the honeybee decline because of pesticide use. We're starting to see how big of a support system they actually really are. And then bats with insect control. So bats play a huge role. I can't remember the numbers, but it's a ridiculous amount of insects that they eat per night. So they are a huge support system for keeping the insect population down. And these are things notice how these are things that you might not know right off the bat until they go away. And then we notice that they actually played a huge role. So a lot of times we don't notice these things until they're gone. And then resilience, how well does it bounce back? Really diverse species in the area, so biodiversity in the area, that would be resilient. So the forest bounces back after a disease wipes out a certain species. So it has to be diverse. If you have one species of something, or it's not genetically diverse, then if something happens, it's going to wipe out that entire population, and it's not going to bounce back very fast. So this definitely relies on species diversity. And then if we look at this last little category here, aesthetic versus instrumental, both of these things play a role in what we call cultural service. So aesthetic would just be, it's beautiful. It has no other purpose, just beautiful. And then instrumental would be we set aside land that we can study and understand better, and gain knowledge from it. So that might be scientific studies or something along those lines. But those fall under cultural services. So all of these things, resilience, support systems, cultural service, provisions, are all looked at as far as the priority that the area gets for being set aside as a natural preserve. And then here's just an example over here. It's kind of a really beautiful picture of the Grand Tetons. If you've never been there, as you're going to Yellowstone, it's incredible. So make sure you stop there in the Tetons by Yellowstone. But that's an example of a cultural service. So it's beautiful, set aside for humans to enjoy and also for us to study as well. And that concludes M59.